To cover important events in early modern England's religious history, we'll start with the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and we'll end with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, about 130 years later. So the Restoration started in Germany with Martin Luther in 1517, and it didn't extend into England until the 1530s, when Henry VIII decided that he wanted to divorce his first wife and marry Anne Boleyn, who would eventually become his second of many wives. Catherine of Aragon, we should note, is Spanish. She was closely related to the Spanish monarchy. So Henry's sort of treatment of her probably helped establish some of the tensions between England and Spain that would sort of erupt at various points for many, many years to come. So the Pope refused to grant Henry his annulment, so he decided to establish a Church of England that was basically a Catholic church, but with him at the head instead of the Pope. However, the Church of England under Henry, it did become more Protestant at times, depending on who Henry's advisors were and how sort of extremely Protestant or not they were. He sort of wavered in how reformed the Church of England was. And Cromwell is an important figure in that. One of the most important advisors in terms of pulling Henry toward the Reformation strongly during his time as Henry's advisor. Probably the most important event during Cromwell's time as an advisor is the dissolution of the monasteries that happened in 1536. And basically that involved the English government deciding to basically destroy Catholic artwork in the monasteries all throughout the country. From the Protestant perspective, the sort of murals and statues and crucifixes and paintings of saints, all of that was a form of idolatry, according to them. And so they considered themselves iconoclasts that needed to destroy these idolatrous images. So the Church of England that we might now think of, or that we might associate with most of the early modern period, really got going under Henry's son, Edward VI, who came to the throne at the age of 9. And Edward had been raised by very strongly Protestant family members who, influenced him. And so a lot of the strong reformations happened during his short reign. For instance, the Catholic Mass was completely abolished, and church services performed in English rather than Latin, which was a very big deal for reformers who wanted to kind of democratize religion and make it more accessible to the people who didn't speak Latin. Unfortunately, Edward was a very sick boy, and his reign was... So he dies at the age of 15, and his half-sister, Mary, takes the throne because she's the oldest living child of their father, Henry VIII. Now, Mary's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, so she's been raised by Spanish Catholics. And Edward had actually tried to get her removed from the line of succession, but after he died, she had enough support from the people in power in England, the nobility, that she was able to um, ascend the throne nonetheless. So Mary comes into power in 1553 and quickly makes a lot of really significant changes to the Church of England, Catholic Church. She had Protestants burned at the stakes as heretics, and many others sort of fled to the continent, different places in Europe. They went into hiding. And eventually she would get the nickname Bloody Mary, which is where the drink comes from, because of her execution of so many Protestant figures when she came to the throne and shortly after. But her reign wouldn't last long. She died in 1558, and her Protestant half sister Elizabeth, who was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, came to the throne, where she would stay for a long time. And one of the most significant books in early modern England, John Fox's Acts and Monuments, otherwise known as Fox's Book of Martyrs, sort of got established shortly after Elizabeth first ascended the throne. The Book of Martyrs essentially tells a bunch of stories of people who were executed under Mary and other people who went into exile because of her. So they're all Protestant martyrs. And the book gets reprinted and expanded over and over again in the decades throughout the early modern period. So Elizabethan England, we're talking 1558 all the way to 1603. So she was on the throne for quite a long time. And she helped make the Church of England, Protestant again, obviously, but also sort of put in place certain things, certain practices of the church that helped her use it as a political tool in a lot of ways. We should also note that there were extreme Protestants, hot Protestants, called Puritans by their critics, who started to surface during Elizabeth's reign, because they were really wanting to push the Church of England to be more reformed, less Catholic, and they were sort of constantly complaining and challenging and pushing in that direction. And they thought that Elizabeth should crack down on recusants, closet Catholics, more. Have them arrested and fined more extremely, that sort of thing. One of the ways that Elizabeth used the Church of England politically was the establishment of the homilies. Actually, this started under her brother, Edward VI, but it's especially important for Elizabeth in part because she's in power for so long. So the first book of homilies was printed during her brother's reign, and it originally included 12 homilies, and one of them was to be read each Sunday during church service. So the preacher could write his own sermon, or he could, read a sermon somebody else had written or published, but at some point in the service, he would have to recite one of the 12 homilies. One of the reasons this is important politically is because homily number 10 is the homily on obedience, that specifically focuses on why all of the people in England should remain obedient to the monarch, even if he or she ends up being a tyrant, that ultimately the monarchy receives its power directly from God and needs to be respected sort of no matter what they end up doing. And so with these 12 homilies, one of each being read at every church service, you would hear the same homily every, 3 months. So 4 times a year, you would hear the homily on obedience. Now, eventually, there were more homilies added So it went up to 33 total. But you would still be hearing then, 2 or 3 times a year, the homily on obedience. So during Elizabeth's reign, about the halfway point, she's excommunicated by the Pope, then Pope Pius V. He writes a papal bull that excommunicates her from the Catholic Church, and effectively he mentions that he will excommunicate anybody who remains obedient to her, and he gives sort of forgiveness to anybody who would go against her. Basically, he's sort of inciting rebellion or even assassination of the monarch in the hopes that a Catholic monarch can be put in her place. And this is way back in 1570, so we'll see how this develops in the decades after while Elizabeth is still alive. So Mary, Queen of Scots, was Elizabeth's cousin, and as her title might suggest, she was the Queen of Scotland. And Mary was also Catholic, and so she was involved in at least one, if not several, plots to try to overthrow Elizabeth, most of them involving her assassination. And then Mary would be placed as the Queen of England because she was Catholic. She had a claim to the throne as a cousin of Elizabeth's. And then they would have her marry somebody, and he would become the King of England, and he would also be Catholic, was the whole idea behind these plots. Well, at least one of them was sort of discovered, and having gone too far, she was put under house arrest for her involvement in the plot, kept under house arrest for some time, and then eventually Elizabeth was convinced by the Privy Council, her advisors, to have Mary executed for this act of treason. This was a really big deal because having a monarch executed, potentially sets a bad precedent, right? It suggests to everybody in the country that monarchs, maybe any monarch, can ultimately be executed. And this is 1587 we're talking about. And then the following year, we have the Spanish Armada. This is where the Spanish fleet of ships sailed for England in another attempt to sort of overthrow Elizabeth and her privy councilors and put in their place a Catholic regime that would be, much friendlier to Spain and the Pope in Rome and the other sort of Catholic powers in Europe. The problem that the Armada came against was mostly weather related, not just in terms of storms, but also the sort of high seas and large waves that dashed many of the Spanish ships against rocks in the sea around England. Another sort of small but worth noting event in the religious political history is the Marprelate controversy, in which there were some tracts that were published under the pseudonym Martin Marprelate, basically heavily criticizing figures very high up in the Church of England. And so essentially it was a sort of Puritan push for the Anglican Church to move further away from what they saw as Catholic practices into a more extreme form of Protestantism. Ultimately, these tracts created a lot of anger amongst the privy councillors, people in power in London, who ended up passing a law against satire, saying that satires could no longer be printed in 1598. And so this is where we get some of the more satiric plays that are written shortly after 1598 by people like John Marston, who had been a satirist but could no longer publish satire sort of by itself and of itself, so had to do some other form of art that he could also be satiric with. Late in Elizabeth's reign, there was an attempt by some of the more militant and hot Protestants to potentially overthrow her, what came to be known as the Essex Rebellion in 1601. And the Earl of Essex had been Elizabeth's sort of main military strategist serving in Ireland, and he'd done some things while serving there that she hadn't approved of. He'd sort of gone against her orders one too many times, so that he was recalled back to England and had sort of punishment within the court of various titles and monies kind of stripped of him. And so this didn't sit well with Essex, and he and many of his supporters really wanted to reestablish his power within the court, and also wanted to push Elizabeth to be more proactive in the military conflicts in Europe between Protestants and Catholics. The day before the Essex Rebellion, February 6, 1601, supporters of the Earl of Essex arranged for the Lord Chamberlain's men, the playing company to which Shakespeare belonged, to put on a production of Richard II, one of Shakespeare's history plays, which by 1601 was quite old. It had been around a long time. They probably hadn't performed it very recently, but the supporters of Essex were willing to pay them a kind of special amount in order for this special performance, so they agreed to do it. And then the next day, Essex and his supporters attempted their rebellion. And so the perception was, after the rebellion failed, that the supporters at least thought that Richard II, this particular Shakespeare history play, would help kind of mobilize more people to their cause, sort of against the current advisors of Elizabeth that were most in power. Apparently it failed. Essex had far fewer supporters than he thought he would. There weren't that many people willing to go against Queen Elizabeth, so he only ended up with maybe about 200 supporters total. Ultimately, he claimed that he wasn't trying to overthrow her, but instead was going to try to overthrow some of her advisors that were chief advisors, in order to kind of force her to take on a different stance in terms of foreign affairs. But regardless of what his end goal was, it failed miserably. He was arrested, the supporters were arrested, they were tried a few weeks later, the trial lasted a day, they were found guilty and eventually executed for treason. And here's a picture of the Earl of Essex, a painting of him. Elizabeth died in 1603, and that's when James VI of Scotland became James I of England. One thing we might note right off the bat about James, not only was he the King of Scotland already while Elizabeth was still Queen of England, his mother was Mary Queen of Scots, the same cousin of Elizabeth's who Elizabeth had had executed in 1587. Ultimately, Elizabeth had been very quiet, even to her most trusted advisors, about who she would name as her successor. as she was getting older and had never married, had no children, there was a lot of sort of anxieties over who would be the next monarch, who would be her successor for the throne. James was considered much more sympathetic to Catholics than Elizabeth had been. So you'll remember that the Puritans had already been complaining for a long time before Elizabeth's death that she wasn't sort of Protestant enough, that the Church of England needed to move further away from Catholicism. But as soon as James ascended the throne, they started very quickly talking about Elizabethan England as a kind of golden age because James was so much more sympathetic to Catholics. His wife was Catholic, and he was less agreeable to the Puritans that tried to influence him and advise him in particular matters. That said, there's one particular event in James's reign, early on in his reign, that did sort of endear him to Protestants. It was the Gunpowder Plot of 1605.
Remember, remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder, treason, and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot.
The Gunpowder Plot was another Catholic conspiracy to overthrow the English government. What differed with this one was that it involved several people in London who were gathering barrels of gunpowder to store underneath Parliament. And the idea was that when King James came to Parliament, they were going to blow it up and basically kill all of the government officials for the national government in London, and that was how they were going to overthrow the government. It didn't work, in part because they had so many people involved that somebody let something slip or somebody snitched or whatever, and they got caught before they were able to go through with it. Also, they hadn't stored the gunpowder very well, so it was probably too damp to really be effective anyways. But this, kind of like the Spanish Armada in 1588, served as yet another example, sort of propaganda-wise, for the sort of righteous and rightness of Protestant England. The idea that God was on the side of the English Protestants and, was orchestrating things to foil yet another Catholic plot. And then in 1606, there was a law passed that basically restricted players, when performing plays, from speaking obscenities or sort of using the Lord's name in vain kind of thing. So the idea was that sort of mild oaths like sblood, which is short for God's blood, or zoons, which is short for God's wounds, that those sort of things were now outlawed, that they couldn't be part of the dialogue performed on stage. And then also any sort of mention of God or Christ directly had to be changed as well. And so you start getting a lot more references to like providence or the heavens or something like that, rather than specific mentions of God in plays. And then in 1611, we have a really important religious moment in terms of the King James Bible, the KJV, King James Version of the Bible, the Authorized Bible, being completed. 47 scholars working together over 7 years produced this. One of the things that's sort of remarkable about that, I mean, it's remarkable that they were able to agree on anything ultimately, But they did actually end up following a lot of the same translations from the Great Bible, which was the sort of earlier kind of authorized version, the earlier Bible in English, available at most parish churches. So they actually didn't change very much about the translation itself. One thing that it did do was it created a far less anti Catholic Bible than the Geneva Bible, which had been the most popular one in English parish churches for several decades at this point. And the Geneva Bible it's a translation of the Bible in English that's filled with marginal glosses. There are notes printed in the margins of pretty much every page, sort of commenting on the text on that page from the Bible. And the vast majority of those glosses are sort of very strongly Protestant, anti Catholic, so that you would have a gloss for the whore of Babylon that gets mentioned in the book of Revelation, and the gloss would specifically note, that this is referring to the false church, the Catholic Church, that sort of thing. James was more sympathetic to Catholics than Elizabeth had been, and wanted a less anti-Catholic Bible to be the official Bible, the authorized one used throughout England in all of the parishes in the Church of England. And so that's how the KJV sort of came into being. The Geneva Bible remained sort of the main Bible around most of the country for a long time afterward, because that's what everybody already had. But there was a large effort to sort of get the authorized version out there, and to have parish churches, purchasing a copy and all of that sort of thing. James died in 1625, and his younger son, Charles, ascended the throne in 1625. So, a quick bit of background for this. James's firstborn son, Henry, was supposed to be the next in line for the throne. And Henry, he gained this sort of reputation as somebody who was planning to be more militaristic and interventionist than his father was. So that as a teenager, Henry seemed that he wanted to take a much more aggressive action in terms of helping out Protestant forces on the continent that were, fighting in like the 30 Years' War. And this was not James's position at all. His motto was "Blessed are the peacemakers." He wanted to bring everybody together under this sort of reunified Christendom. But Henry was very much more of a kind of hardline, hot Protestant, not quite to the extent we might imagine a Puritan to be, but certainly somebody who the faction at court who wanted more military intervention, who was more strongly, radically Protestant, were very much in support of Henry and excited for him to take the throne whenever he would end up doing so. But then Henry died before his father did. And so when James dies in 1625, it's the younger son, Charles, who takes the throne. And Charles had not been groomed to be king. His older brother had been. And Charles was even more sort of sympathetic to Catholics than his father had been. His mother was a Catholic. He ended up marrying a Catholic. So eventually this leads to the English Civil War. And I'm not going to get into too much detail about the Civil War in terms of battles and years and anything to that extent. But I do want to focus a little bit here on, sort of the outcome of these religious tensions. So Charles dissolves Parliament in 1640, only a few weeks after a new Parliament had been summoned. He was trying to get them to help finance military campaign dealing with the Scottish, and they wanted to sort of curtail the king's power. They wanted to make Parliament more central to the runnings of the English government than it had been. And Charles didn't like that, and so he got rid of them, sent them all home. But then after a few months, he needed them to sort of come back and, do some stuff for him so that the government could run. And so he summons what came to be known as the Long Parliament. And the reason they are the Long Parliament instead of the Short Parliament that he had dismissed is because as soon as he summons them, shortly after, they start passing laws and new edicts that basically make it harder for the king to dissolve them. They make it so that the parliament has to meet at least once every 3 years, whether the king likes it or not. And eventually, they end up passing restrictions on the king's ability to dissolve them at all. And then in 1642, the Puritans now, the sort of radical Protestants, finally achieve what they'd been trying to do since the 1580s in closing the theaters. But instead of appealing to sort of English culture, writing treatises to try to turn people away from the theaters, convincing them that it was a corrupt and unholy thing to do, there was enough of them controlling Parliament that they simply passed an act that closed all the theaters in London, and all of them were torn down within the following year or two after that. And then skipping ahead a little bit, avoiding any mention of some military campaigns and such, by 1649, there were enough sort of radical Protestant, hot Protestant Puritans in power in Parliament, and they had been at war with the King of England and his supporters for long enough that they ended up arresting him and trying him for treason. And they decided that he was guilty and had him executed. The only time an English monarch has ever been executed by an act of Parliament. And so by now it's, sort of thoroughly, completely under the control of the sort of extreme Protestant side. The Puritans are the ones in power. They go on to form this sort of interregnum government, or what we now think of as the interregnum government, a commonwealth, with Oliver Cromwell at the head. But Cromwell basically ends up being a kind of elected dictator, doesn't operate all that differently from the way the monarch had before, and then he dies. They have to find somebody to replace him. His son tries to, but he can't really make it work. And so by 1660, 11 years after the execution of Charles I, Charles II, King Charles I's son, is restored as the monarch. And Parliament decides to restore the monarchy completely, and Charles is welcomed back into London. And the Puritan faction that had orchestrated the execution of his father, basically any of them that are surviving and that haven't fled the country are executed pretty quickly after that. So at this point, the monarchy wins, the Puritans lose, and then we get Restoration drama because the theaters are reopened, and King Charles II decides that women should be allowed to perform in plays just like men. And so we start getting Restoration plays that include women playing women's roles and plays that just end up being very different from what had come a few decades earlier before the theater ban had been put in place in 1642.